Negative effects of the Industrial Revolution. We're going to go through this as quickly as we can here. So the haves, these would be the entrepreneurs, individuals who start new businesses, who open factories and shipping companies. They became very rich during the Industrial Revolution. The have-nots would be people who worked in the factories for the entrepreneurs, the working class. As you see, they were so crushingly poor. Urbanization would be the movement of people to the cities. The Industrial Revolution brought rapid urbanization. And remember, also with the enclosure movement, people had nowhere to go really, so they gravitate toward the urban areas. So there you go. Population explosion, high demand for workers causes urbanization. And the enclosure movement. A couple of maps here of urbanization. Let's go back. So, city life grew around the factories. These cities grew rapidly without planning. Some people lived in tenements or slums. The lack of planning meant there was no sewage, no running water, no sanitation system. So think about that. Here's some pictures of some people living. There's no sanitation. What they would do is they'd pile the trash up in the streets. In some cases, it would get to about 2 stories tall. You see this right here? It's just trash rotting away in an alley. You have crowded, filthy slums, breeding ground for diseases such as cholera. And you're going to get cholera basically from drinking contaminated water with waste matter in it. And it's invisible, it's microscopic, so you can't see it. But they didn't have sewage systems back then, and they would dump their sewage into the river. And that's also where they pulled their water from, drinking water. Water would literally kill you back then. Working life in the factories. Factory life was difficult, dangerous, typical shift 12 to 16 hours. If you complained, you're fired. If you got sick, you're fired. If you got hurt and you could no longer work, you were fired. So typically if you lost a finger or you lost something that you could put a wrapping on, you got back to work within the hour. So women at work, as you see, factory owners hired women because they could pay them less. Women with families worked 12 hours a day, and they were still expected to cook, clean, keep the house when they finally got home. Children at work, families needed the income of working kids, so kids had to go to work. If you could stand up and you could carry a pail, you worked. Typically, that was around 5 or 6 years of age. As you see, kids would be hired at even lower wages than women. Children worked in the same dangerous conditions in factories, and they worked the same long hours. Guys, think about it this way. If you don't have an education to this day, you're going to be exploited in the workforce. You will not make as much money as somebody who has a higher education, typically. You are taken advantage of to this day because you are a child. Even when you turn 16 and you go get that first job and stuff, minimum wage is not a living wage anymore. So you're not even going to make enough to live on. So you will be taken advantage of today. As you get older and as you get more educated, you value your time and you want more money for your time. So workers are going to respond to these awful conditions. They protest these conditions. These protests were put down violently by the British government. Just as the U.S. government, they see both the British and the U.S. government will see unions as unlawful. They don't like them in the early days over here in the U.S. as well. And so these workers really have to fight and die sometimes for their rights to be heard or for their concerns to be heard and for them to get new reforms for their workplace safety. So workers' response continues. The Luddites, as you see, skilled workers rejected the new machines that cost them their jobs by smashing them up. So workers' response continued. Methodism is a new religious movement founded by John Wesley. Methodist. These are the Methodists. Working people tried to focus on a better life to come rather than their lives on earth. So finally, we get new ways of thinking. The Industrial Revolution changed the way people thought about everything from economics to the way government should work. David Ricardo, the iron law of wages. Workers should be paid only enough to survive. If they make more money, they will have more children, become poor, and die off from starvation. So basically, you want to pay these workers just enough to survive so they won't have too many kids. So workers should be satisfied with their wages because they are at a natural level. Ricardo's ideas lead many to believe that people are poor because some personal flaw in their character. Guys, these thoughts still persist today. Right here in the U.S., they still persist today, and they think that because you are not a leader in some form or fashion, you've got some character flaw, and you're just not you can't succeed. So you see the rise of socialism. These are critics of the Industrial Revolution. They wanted a more equal distribution of wealth. Many were labeled utopians because people thought their ideas would be just impossible to put into practice. And remember, utopian, that's a word that means paradise. Robert Owen set up the ideal working community. He called it New Harmony. Workers worked less. Children were taken care of while parents worked. Productivity and profits also increased. So communism and capitalism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels witnessed the horrors of the Industrial Revolution in Germany, what will become Germany. Together they write the Communist Manifesto, and the following chart outlines the differences between capitalism and communism, or capitalism and socialism. Okay, the true communism that we know today is really invented in Russia, and they skip a lot of the steps that this book talks about. So while you're looking at this chart here, keep in mind the Communist Manifesto. Basically, Karl Marx says that he goes back and does a history of economies. You have a traditional economy, which is traditions passed down from one generation to the other. Then he said you move into these different types of economies. Of course, free enterprise is the fourth stage out of the 5 stages. He said what we would evolve into would be more of a socialist economy to protect the worker, and the workers would control the workplace. So in Russia, they skip steps 2, 3, and 4. So anyway, as you look, founder of capitalism, Adam Smith, Karl Marx, Communism, the books, Inquiry into the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, the Communist Manifesto is Karl Marx. So the view of government, you can read this stuff, guys. I'm just going to kind of go through it here. This is an activity you've got to do anyway. So how to improve social conditions. The government, as you see, ownership of the economy will end hunger, poverty, and slave-like working conditions. Look under capitalism. If the people work hard enough, they can lift themselves out of poverty. So there's your individual freedoms. On the future. There you go. So, legislation and reform. Early attempts to regulate these factories were weak and ineffective. Unions were outlawed because they would interfere with the natural order. Remember what Ricardo said. Legislation and reform. Child labor was limited, not abolished. Kids in the textile mills were limited to 12-hour workdays. Most in the mines, shipyards, and factories worked more than 12 hours a day. So we need to know the Factory Acts of 1833, 42, and 47. You need to know it limits child labor, prohibited children under 10 in the mines, and it set maximum number of working hours for women and children at 10 hours. We are finished. Oh no, what did this thing just do?